Hello YouTube. So today we're going to start up some more drama by doing a tier list video. This time it will be pre-Fontaine for our star tier list. Unlike my 5-star tier list, I'm not going to try to grade each unit on specific categories because I feel like with 4 stars there's just too much nuance you have to consider. Plus I don't really judge 4 stars by the same standards that I judge 5 stars by. And also, there's just way more 4-star units than 5 stars, so we would be here literally all day if I tried to do this the same way I did the 5-star video. But for our tiers, we have your typical S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, and D tier. But we also have a borderline tier. The borderline tier is for units that I think are definitely too good to be in the same tier as the units in A tier. And I think you could make a strong argument for them being in S tier, but I think you could also make a good argument against them being in S tier at the same time. But still, again, too good to be in A tier, so these units are kind of just like borderline, hovering between the border between S and A. But yeah, with that said, we're just gonna jump right into this and start. And the first unit we'll talk about is Xingqiu. He's an obvious S tier. I don't think there's much to say. Next, let's put Faishal. I'm gonna put Faishal into borderline. I know a lot of people are probably expecting her to be in S tier, but the reason why I don't think she should be quite in S tier is she has some issues such as being very single target oriented, and the Abyss is very rarely going to be pure single target. So in the AoE chambers, you will have some fall off with her, not super significant unless it's like massive AoE, but still something that I think kind of prevents her from being an S tier. And also on top of that, she's really only best unit in teams like Aggravate. Yeah, pretty much just Aggravate teams where she's like really good. She's still good in other teams. She's just not super good like she's in Aggravate teams anywhere else. The Aggravate teams are really good. I just don't think it's enough to justify putting her into S tier. Then let's see. Well, Amber's sitting right here, so I'm just gonna place her. I'm gonna put Amber into C tier. Amber is obviously not a very good character. The only thing stopping her from being in D tier is she does have one justifiable use case, which is using her as an elegy bot for viridescent VV Vape Tau teams. I don't think it's a good enough use case to justify her being anywhere above C tier, but it's still a good enough use case to justify her being in C and not D, so I think C is a good placement. Then, also I forgot to mention, I'm going to be evaluating each unit at Constellation 6, so each unit's placement is based on their best performance at C6. Now let's talk about Kaya. So since this is with C6 in mind, I think Kaya can be justified in A tier. At C6, Kaya is absolutely incredible for teams like Melt Diluc, and he can also be a really good sub DPS for teams like Freeze teams and Mono Cryo teams and stuff like that. His damage is just really good at C6, and the rate at which he applies Cryo is just absolutely insane at C6. I think he's a justifiable A tier. Zhongling, I think, deserves S tier. She's not super great outside of like Vaporized teams and Monopyro teams, but she's so good and so irreplaceable in those teams that she's amazing in that I think she deserves an S tier. And even outside of those teams, she can just make a good sub DPS for a 4th slot for pretty much any team that has a Bennett where she can fit in without messing up reactions. So like using her as the 4th unit in a Wanderer or Zhao team, she can work really well just simply due to doing so much damage. So yeah, I think she has enough use cases where she's just really strong to justify her being an S tier. Then, let's see, Cujo Sara, I am going to put in B tier. She is technically the most powerful option for the 4th slot on a riding team if we're considering her at C6. But the thing is, there's very often just practical issues that make her not actually always the best slot for a riding team, such as like AoE, multi-wave, and stuff like that. She just tends to run into a bunch of practical issues that could be solved by using somebody else in her place, like Yai or Faishal, or playing riding National instead of Hyper, or even using Yelan as the 4th slot. Just she's powerful, but she runs into practical issues, and she's very replaceable, so I don't think I can put her any higher than B tier, especially when that's really the only team that she's good in. Now, Bennett, obvious S tier. He's the most irreplaceable unit in the entire game. I don't think much more needs to be said on that. Ningguang is going to be our first D tier. I don't think Ningguang is a good unit. She's very single target focused, and she's not even good in single target. Her damage is just not good. I feel like she really got left behind with the buffs Geo got, since there was all like defense-based stuff like the Husk set and Guro, so she really just fell behind and wasn't able to keep up with the times. Hopefully she'll get some new tools to be more useful in the future. Next, Farazan. I'm going to put her into borderline. I want to put her in S tier, but only thing stopping me from putting her into S tier is she only has 2 teams where she's really good, which is Hyper Wanderer and Hyper Zhao. Those are 2 of the most powerful teams in the entire game, but at the same time it is still only 2 teams, so you can definitely argue her to be S tier because she's so powerful and so irreplaceable in those teams, and again, those are 2 of the most powerful teams in the entire game, but it is still, at the end of the day, only 2 teams, so that's the only thing keeping her in borderline and not into S tier. But if you were to argue that she should be an S tier, I wouldn't argue against you. Next, Layla, I am going to put into A tier. So Layla is the best shield option for Wanderer by a pretty good margin. And aside from that, she's also really good in mono cryo teams. She's great in mono cryo teams because she covers your shielder slot while also being able to do pretty good damage thanks to her C6, giving her a free 40% damage bonus. And also being able to use something like Harbinger of Dawn to hit really high crit value to take advantage of that damage bonus as well. So Hyper Wanderer and Mono Cryo are two pretty good teams in which she is very good in. I think that's enough to justify her being an A tier. And then Kuki, I think, can justify S tier. I think you could also justify moving her down to borderline, but I think S tier is justifiable. She's so good in Hyper Bloom teams, and she's also pretty good as a 4th unit in Quick Bloom teams like Quick Bloom Sino and Quick Bloom Alhaitham. So I think S tier is good for her. Next S tier is Sucrose. I'm going to be honest, I think Sucrose is a very overrated unit. People thinking she's comparable to Kazuha in a lot of teams where she really isn't. But at the same time, that's not it. She's still S tier, even though I do think she's kind of overrated. She's still a very powerful buffer. I just think if you try to use her for crowd control, you're a little insane. But using her as a buffer, she is very powerful, and she can free up your Kazuha, so that's very justifiable reason for her to be up in S tier. Rosario, I'm going to put her into A tier. Rosario has a lot of teams where she's really good. She's in one of the best 4th slots for a Wanderer team. She's great in physical teams like Eula and Xingqiu physical teams. She's great in reverse melt teams focused on her damage. She's great in freeze teams. She's great in mono cryo teams. But in those teams, she is fairly replaceable, and a lot of those teams where she's good just aren't quite powerful enough for me to justify putting her anywhere above A tier. Plus, she also has issues like being circle impact, so if enemies move outside of her burst, she just loses all of her damage and most of her value, so I don't think she can be justified any higher than A tier, but I don't think putting her below A tier would be reasonable with how many teams she works great in. Then Yunjin, I think, is also a good A tier. She doesn't have that many teams where she works great, since there's just not that many normal attack-based DPS. But she is absolutely incredible for both Wanderer and Yoimiya, which are really good teams. She is fairly replaceable in those teams, though. Like, you can use Bennett instead of her with Yoimiya and get very similar output. And she tends to be the best option for Wanderer in single target, but in AoE she falls off a bit due to her stack limit, so I think A tier is fair, but I don't think she can go anywhere above A because of the issues that she does has, plus her limited use cases. And Diona, I'm going to put into C tier. Reason she's only in C tier is mainly because Layla exists, and I don't think there's much reason to ever use Diona over Layla unless you just don't have Layla. Diana really just doesn't have any advantages over Layla, other than the fact that she can heal, but if you have a shielder, you don't really need a healer, so unless you're facing something like Corrosion, like from the Wolves in the Current Abyss, then she can make sense over Layla, but in most scenarios, you'd really just rather use Layla than Diana, so I don't think I can justify putting her above C tier. Then, Bido, I'm going to put into B tier. You could probably argue her up into A tier, but the reason I have her in B tier is just because she falls off so hard in single target. And again, the Abyss is very rarely going to be purely AoE, so she's usually going to have pretty steep fall off in at least 1 out of the 3 chambers. And also, she has a really bad energy issues if you aren't using her in a double electro team, so that really limits her use case, so she is very powerful when things work well for her, but her limited use case just keeps her down to B tier in my opinion. Sayo, she is going to be our next D tier. I think Sayo is a pretty bad unit. There's just really no reason I can think of why you would ever use Sayo in a team unless you just really like Sayo and want to make use out of her. All she provides is some off-field and Nemo application and some pretty decent healing, but like, it's not something you would ever actually want to use. Like, consolidating the role of a Nemo and healer is actually not that useful, especially when it comes with as high of an energy cost as Sayo while providing as little value as she does outside of healing. So yeah, I just can't justify putting her above D tier. And in that same vein, I'm going to put Dory into D tier. I think she's also pretty bad. I don't think there's any reason why you should ever use her when Kuki Shinobu exists. She's just like, yeah, pretty bad unit. Next, Yenfei, I am going to put into B tier. As a DPS, Yenfei can do pretty well. She's mainly held back by her massive energy issues, very hard to use her burst tries per rotation, and she's also held back by just how long her field time requirements are. Her burst duration is 15 seconds, so that really kind of limits her rotational flexibility and stuff like that. Then at C4, she can also be used as a support, providing a good shield, but it's not that useful because, again, using her as a shield, the main value she would provide is Thrilling Tales, but if using Thrilling Tales, you're not going to be able to use an energy recharge weapon on her. If you're not using an ER weapon on her, then she's pretty much just not going to be able to burst every rotation, so you're not actually going to have that shield every rotation. But there are still some pretty solid niche scenarios where she can be a good shielder, like with a VV Veputao team and stuff like that, so that, alongside her being a pretty decent 4-star DPS, I think justifies her being in B tier. Barbara is going to be our next C tier. Barbara's not that great, but she does have some decent use cases, like being an on-field Hyper Bloom driver and being used in Nilu Bloom and stuff like that. She's pretty much never going to be the best option for these type of teams, but for an account that has like a limited amount of Hydro units on it, then using her in teams like that to free up your other Hydro units for other team, I think that's a justifiable enough reason to use Barbara to justify her being in C tier and not D, so I think C is a fair placement. Next, Razor, I think he's a solid B tier. He's pretty decent for a 4-star DPS, and he also has his overbudget teams, which in the right scenarios can be very powerful. They have some practical issues, like needing to be within side Bennett's burst while having overloads and stuff like that going on, so it's got some practical issues, but overall, he's a pretty decently powerful character. I think B tier is fair. Domo is going to be our next borderline character. Burgeon teams are pretty powerful. I don't think they're quite as powerful as like Hyperbloom teams, so I can't really justify putting him in S tier with Kuki. But he's still really powerful, and even outside of Dendro teams, he's a great shielder for teams like Hyper Wanderer, Hyper Zhao, can even be used for stuff like Uremia and Tutao. Plus he enables things like Quickborn and Chaos Sino, so he has a lot of really good use cases, just not quite justifiable for S tier in my opinion, but I think he's definitely overall better than the units in A tier, so I think borderline makes sense. Next, Yao, I'm going to put in A tier. Pretty good for consolidating the role of Dendro and healing. She has quite a lot of practical issues, but even despite those practical issues, she's still good enough to be worth A tier in my opinion, just because off-field Dendro application plus healing is just that good. It's enough to kind of overlook her practical issues. Carly, I think B tier makes sense. She has a lot of issues like her ICD, making her Dendro application not that good, circle impacts, and short duration, stuff like that really makes her very rarely a great Dendro option, but from what I've seen, she is really good in Needle Bloom teams, so that is one use case scenario where she's really good, but from what I see, she's very replaceable for that slot, so I don't think I can justify putting her above B tier with how replaceable she is for that, but it's a good enough use case for her to be in B tier. Kirara, pretty similar to Yao Yao, but with less practical issues in my opinion. I think A tier is fair for her. Who else do we have? Xingqiu, I'm gonna put in C tier. He's really fallen off. His ability to infuse your weapon with cryo is just not that useful anymore. There's really not many good use cases for it other than shield breaking. And for shield breaking, there's just other ways to break shields that won't be a dead slot on your team like he will. He can be good in like mono cryo teams and reverse melt teams, but I don't think he's that great for them. But it's a decent enough use case to justify being C tier and not D. So yeah, I think this is a fair placement for him. Who else do we have? Candice, I think, is a solid B tier. Provides good AoE off-field Hydra application. Alright, next, I think Guro. Wait, that's not Guro. I think Guro is a solid A tier. He's absolutely integral to Ito and Noel hypercarry teams. Those are pretty much the only teams he's useful in, but he's absolutely integral to those teams, and Ito hypercarry is a strong enough team for me to justify putting Guro into A tier, so yeah, I'm gonna have him in A tier. And then, since we grabbed him by accident, I'll just place Cava in B tier. I don't actually know how good his Bloom teams are. From what I've seen, they don't seem to be anything too impressive, but they're also not bad either. They're kind of just pretty decent. He could possibly be an A tier, but I don't know enough about him to put him in A tier, so I think B tier is a safe placement for him. Micah, I think, is a solid B tier as well. He's pretty good as a Bennett alternative for Wanderer teams as long as you're using Yunjin as the 4th slot, but that does kind of restrict it to single target since Yunjin's not that great in AoE, mainly useful for single target. Then he's also pretty decent for Eula physical teams. Not super great for her, really disappointing for a dedicated support, but he does still technically raise her ceiling. He's just tends to have some practical issues with it and not that significant of an upgrade over using someone like Rosario for Eula, but I think still good enough for B tier, so that's what he'll be. Noelle is another B tier. As a DPS, she's pretty decent for a 4-star, and she has really good AoE. Mainly held back by the fact that she makes no particles at all, so if you want to reliably keep her burst up, you have to really be quick swapping and feeding energy to her, which can be very annoying and can cause you to miss out on a good amount of damage since you have to spend so much time swapping off of her. But despite that, I think she's still decent enough for B tier. Next, Xingqiu, I think she's a solid B tier. As a shielder, she's rarely going to be the best option, but what she does provide over other shield options is that she's absolutely incredible for breaking enemy shields because she applies so much rapid AoE pyro application, then continues to apply AoE pyro from off-field with her shield, so if you're ever in a situation where you need both a shielder and a shield breaker, she can make a really good pick for some teams. Then as a DPS, she has physical teams, mono pyro teams with C6 Bennett, and can be used as a burst-based DPS for something like a Eula team where you use her physical burst, but relying on it having its guaranteed chance to crit. I think her best use case as a DPS is in mono pyro teams. Her physical teams Her physical teams are fairly in line with her pyro teams in terms of damage output, but Mono Pyro is just way more practical, so you have Kazuha for grouping, which is really useful since you need to be within Bennett's burst with Xingqiu. And also because you have your damage pretty evenly split between Xingqiu and Zhongling, it just makes rotations way more flexible, makes the team way more reliable. And I think her DPS teams are decent enough to warrant B tier. They're fairly in line with other 4-star DPS like Yenfei, Noel, and Razor, so I think B tier is a pretty reasonable spot for her. And then I believe that's everybody. This isn't ordered within tiers. There's just so many 4-star units and so much nuance to consider. I think it would be pretty impossible to try to accurately order everything within the tiers, so don't look at this and think that because I have Guro at the top of A tier, it means that I think he's way better than Yao Yao who's out the back. That's not what this is. They're not ordered like that. But yeah, anyway, let me know your thoughts on this list below. If there's anything you would change, let me know what you would change and why. And also, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.